Choose your associates wisely. Associates are powerful influences. Associates can influence us for good or for bad. Let's have a look at Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20. The one walking with the wise will become wise. The one who has dealings with the stupid will fare badly. Now, the Hebrew word for stupid, as it were, implies being insensible to moral truth. Wise persons, on the other hand, act with sensibleness and discretion and use sound judgment and avoid dangers. David appreciated the value of good associates. Let's have a look at Psalm 64, verse 2. So that's Psalm 64, and we're looking at verse 2. Shield me from the secret plots of wicked men, from a crowd of wrongdoers. And if we turn a few pages over to chapter 142 of Psalms, so that's 142, and we're going to look at verse 7. That tells us, bring me out of the dungeon to praise your name. May the righteous gather around me, because you deal kindly with me. Now, he desired Jehovah's friendship, realizing it was not possible if he associated with wicked men. Now, David benefited from friendship of Jonathan, some 30 years in his senior. Let's have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 to 4. So that's 1 Samuel, and looking at chapter 18, verses 1 to 4. So considering their age difference, we do find a very close relationship here, which benefited them mutually. Now, we're looking at chapter 18 then of 1 Samuel, and it's verses 1 to 4. As soon as David had finished speaking to Saul, Jonathan and David became bound together in close friendship, and Jonathan began to love him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him, and he did not allow him to return to his father's house. And Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the sleeveless coat that he wore and gave it to David, along with his gear, his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, if we turn over there to chapter 23 and look at verses 16 to 18, we get more insight into the closeness that they had there. Now it tells us, Jonathan, the son of Saul, now went out to David at Horesh, and he helped him find strength in Jehovah. He said to him, do not be afraid, for my father Saul will not find you. You will be king over Israel, and I will become second to you. My father Saul also knows that. Then the two of them made a covenant before Jehovah, and David stayed in Horesh, and Jonathan went to his home. Quite touching words, really, aren't they? Now, association with wrongdoers has led some to spiritual ruin. Now, you probably would have expected this scripture in this particular public talk, but let's have a read of it anyway in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. Now, this is something that Paul mentions here about choosing associates wisely. Now, it tells us there quite clearly, do not be misled. Bad associations spoil useful habits. Now, it's resulted in a moral conduct and addiction to alcohol, to drugs, and so many other things. Now, heeding the Bible's straightforward counsel, which we just read there in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, and having that clear direction on the matter of association will safeguard us from being misled. So we need to appreciate But we are gregarious people and we need companions. But we need to have spiritual companions. Now, Paul tells of the rich reward from gathering together. Now, let's have a look at Hebrews chapter 10. It's probably a scripture that you've heard before, but let's just have a look at it from this context. Hebrews chapter 10, and we're looking at verses 23 to 25. Let us hold firmly the public declaration of our hope without wavering, for the one who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another so as to incite to love and fine works, not forsaking our meeting together as some have a custom, but encouraging one another, and all the more so as you see the day drawing near. So we see there the importance that Paul expressed about having good companionships by meeting together. Now, even Jehovah, complete in himself, saw value of companionship with others. He surrounded himself with myriads of spirit sons who received blessings from his association. Now let's have a look at Job 38 verses 4 to 7. So that's Job chapter 38 verses 4 to 7. Where were you when I founded the earth? Tell me if you think you understand. Who sets its measures in case you know, or who stretched a measuring line across it? Into what were its pedestals sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars joyfully cried out together, and all the sons of God began shouting in applause. So we see there that the direct companionships that Jehovah has with his spirit sons in heaven there. Now, we can also relate that to Daniel chapter 7. So that's Daniel chapter 7, and we're looking at verse 10 in particular here. It says, a stream of fire was flowing and going out from before him. 1,000 thousands kept ministering to him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court took its seat and books were opened. So again, we see a reference there to the amount of spirit sons that are in heaven there. Now, unfaithful angels who abandoned association with Jehovah lost their valuable benefits and future prospects. This is something that Peter mentioned in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. Certainly, God did not refrain from punishing the angels who sinned, but threw them into Tartarus, putting them in chains of dense darkness to be reserved for judgment. Now, true spiritual companionship is a protection against depression, doubts, and falling prey to Satan. Satan seeks to devour all sheep-like ones. He tries to get them isolated from the congregation and involved in worldly pursuits. Isolation can result in spiritual sickness, apostasy, and even death. Now, let's have a look at Proverbs chapter 18, verse 1. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 1. Whoever isolates himself pursues his own selfish desires. He rejects all practical wisdom. Thus, we do not want to stay away from the meetings, as we read there in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Now, we need to choose exemplary associates among God's people. So, does that mean that everybody in the congregation is good association? Well, sadly not. We do need to, again, in the Christian congregation, we need to be very, very careful about who we associate with. Now, let's have a look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 20. Now in a large house there are utensils, not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and earthenware, and some for an honourable use, but others for use lacking honour. So we see that a bit of a warning, don't we? So, but does that mean that you should treat maybe people who aren't good as example differently to others? Well, no, because we're supposed to show love even to our enemies, aren't we? So really, we want to be very careful, though, about who we spend our time with and who we associate with. Now, we need to select those who will exert wholesome, upbuilding influence on us and our decisions. We need to work to develop desirable qualities in ourselves so that we will be valued associates of others. We need to be especially guided by Bible principles in choosing a marriage mate as well. Now, we need to shun developing any romantic interest in one who is not in the Lord, as it were. Let's have a look at the Bible principle here, mentioned in 1 Corinthians, and we're looking at chapter 7, verse 39. So that's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39. A wife is bound as long as her husband is alive, but if her husband should fall asleep in death, she is free to be remarried to whoever she wants, but only in the Lord. Now, we need to consider as a possible associate for life only one who has demonstrated faithfulness and spiritual qualifications. So it's a very serious decision, since marriage mates will have a lifelong influence on each other. So we certainly don't want to be jumping into marriage blindly, do we? We need to give it very careful consideration. But we also need to avoid association with wrongdoers. Now, the Bible's counsel clearly warns against the bad influence of wrongdoers. Now, there's 3 scriptures that we can look at here. First of all, let's have a look at Exodus chapter 23, verse 2. So that's Exodus chapter 23, and we're going to look at verse 2. You must not follow after the crowd to do evil, and you must not pervert justice by giving testimony to go along with the crowd. Now, that's one Bible principle we've got there, but let's have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. We'll see how that marries up there. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven ferments the whole batch of dough? That's an interesting expression, isn't it? Now, let's just review 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 2 there. And we see how that harmonises as well. So 2 Peter, all the twos, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 2. Furthermore, many will follow their brazen conduct, and because of them, the way of the truth will be spoken of abusively. So we see we don't really want to be associating with anybody who's practicing wrongdoing in any way. Now, youths and adults alike need to be selective in choosing companions. We need to avoid unnecessary association with what's termed as worldlings. Now let's have a look at John 15, verse 19. So that's John chapter 15, verse 19. If you were part of the world would be fond of what is its own. Now, because you are no part of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, for this reason the world hates you. Now, let's just turn over a page or two there to John chapter 17, verse 14. And I have given your word to them, but the world has hated them, because they are no part of the world, just as I am no part of the world. Now, let's just marry that one up with 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 to 11. So that's 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 to 11. In my letter, I wrote to stop keeping company with sexually immoral people, not meaning entirely with the sexual immoral people of this world, or the greedy people of extortioners or idolaters. Otherwise, you would actually have to get out of the world. But now I'm writing to you to stop keeping company with anyone called a brother who is sexually immoral, or a greedy person, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, not even eating with such a man. So that too gives us a very, very clear warning, doesn't it? To avoid association with people who practice such things. But does that mean that we should treat them disrespectfully? Well, of course not, no, because Jehovah told us to love people. And that's not just our brothers and sisters, but also our neighbour. So we do need to be cautious there, don't we? We don't want to just sort of look down on people, because otherwise that would give a false impression. Now, these may be considered good persons, but they have not shown themselves to be wise persons who fear Jehovah. Now, youths wisely avoid association with unbelievers at school proms, in extracurricular activities, and on other occasions. Adults similarly follow Christian principles when they are invited to class reunions, office parties, or other social functions. We must also carefully select reading material, movies, television programs, and so forth. Now, let's have a look at the scriptural principles here in Ephesians Chapter 5. So that's Ephesians Chapter 5. And let's look at verses 3 and 4 to begin with. Let sexual immorality and every sort of uncleanness or greediness not even be mentioned among you, just as is proper for holy people. Neither shameful conduct, nor foolish talking, nor obscene jesting, things that are not befitting, but rather the giving of thanks. So, on a lot of, say, such as soap operas on the TV these days, isn't it not often mentioned about cases of sexual immorality and other sorts of uncleanness? So that's quite interesting to ponder on that, isn't it? Now, let's also have a look at Colossians Chapter 3, verses 5 to 10. Colossians 3, verses 5 to 10. Deaden therefore your body members that are on the earth, as respects sexual immorality, uncleanness, uncontrolled sexual passion, hurtful desire, and greediness, which is idolatry. On account of those things, the wrath of God is coming. And we certainly don't want to be caught up in that, do we? Now it goes on to say there, that is how you too used to conduct yourselves in your former way of life. But now you must put them all away from you, wrath, anger, badness, abusive speech, and obscene talk out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another. Strip off the old personality with its practices, and clothe yourselves with the new personality, which through accurate knowledge is being made new according to the image of the one who created it. So considering verse 9 there, do not lie to one another, strip off the old personality with its practices. And it goes on to say, and clothe yourselves with a new personality. Would you be doing that if you were associating with people who did the opposite? That's a good point, isn't it? Now, as we can see there, identifying with soap opera characters who depict unclean conduct will corrupt good thinking. Another thing to watch out for as well is apostate literature that is aimed at corrupting away our minds and calls for special wariness. Now let's have a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Just on this particular point of note, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And let's consider together verses 3 and 4. But I am afraid that somehow, as the serpent seduced Eve by its cunning, your minds might be corrupted away from the sincerity and the chastity that are due for Christ. For as it is, if someone comes and preaches a Jesus other than the one we preached, or you received a spirit other than what you received, or good news other than what you accepted, you easily put up with him. For I consider that I have not proved inferior to your superfine apostles in a single thing. But even if I am unskilled in speech, I certainly am not in knowledge. Indeed, we made it clear to you in every way and in everything. So it's kind of interesting that, isn't it? Because apostasy was found in Paul's day, but it's also found today as well. So we have to be very sort of careful about who we associate in that manner, because they might actually seem like sheep, but are they? Now, this verse reads the same in any translation of the Bible that you find out there today. So it is something that was very prominent in Paul's time, and also very, very, very prevalent today. Now, it would be foolhardy to expose ourselves to association with such ones through their literature. Again, it'd be kind of like that soap opera thing. Wouldn't be exposing ourselves to something that would be detrimental to our spirituality. So let's have a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and look at verses 13 to 15 if you're still there. So verses 13 to 15. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself keeps disguising himself as an angel of light. So he might look like a sheep, but is he? No, he isn't. It is therefore nothing extraordinary if his ministers also keep disguising themselves as ministers of righteousness, but their end will be according to their works. And of course, we don't want to be caught up in their works, do we? Now, let's just marry that with Titus chapter 3, which is just after Hebrews and there. Sorry, just before Hebrews there, sorry, I meant to say. Now, we're going to have a look at chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. But have nothing to do with foolish arguments and knowledges and disputes and fights over the law, for they are, what's the word there? Unprofitable and futile. As for a man who promotes a sect, reject him after a first and a second admonition. Now, such literature would be poisonous and designed to deceive. In other words, it's going to be untrustworthy and untrue. And we certainly don't want to listen to anything that's untrue, do we? Let's have a look at 1 John chapter 2, verse 19. They went out from us, but they were not of our sort. For if they had been of our sort, they would have remained with us. But they went out so that it might be shown that not all are of our sort. So, those ones who are interested in truth, those ones who are interested in serving Jehovah, they would be remaining with us if they had that disposition. So, does that mean that apostates or anybody else who's left the congregation, does that mean that they don't have the ability to come back to Jehovah? Well, yes, of course they do, as long as they are repentant and as long as they do Jehovah's will. So we need to fill our lives with godly influences that are true. Let's have a look at Proverbs chapter 4, 23. So verse 23, then it says, above all the things that you guard, safeguard your heart, for out of it are the sources of life. Now, we need to walk with Jehovah and associate with his people. Faithful servants of Jehovah have continually sought his association. So let's have a look at Proverbs chapter 3, verse 32. Just a page beyond there. Now, Proverbs chapter 3:32 tells us, for Jehovah detests a devious person, but his close friendship is with the upright. Micah 4:5, how does that relate? So that's Micah chapter 4, verse 5. For all the peoples will walk, each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of Jehovah our God forever and ever. Now Joseph kept Jehovah before him constantly, resulting in moral protection. Now I'm sure you already know this story before we even go there, but let's have a look at Genesis 39, verse 9. Genesis chapter 39, verse 9, it tells us, there is no one greater in this house than I am, and he has not withheld from me anything at all except you, because you are his wife. So how could I commit this great badness and actually sin against God? So when Joseph was put under pressure by Potiphar's wife there, that was what he came out with. And didn't that just guide him? And didn't it just protect him? Now Moses was also guided by the one who is invisible. Let's have a look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27. By faith he left Egypt, but not fearing the anger of the king, for he continued steadfast as seeing the one who is invisible. Now, placing Jehovah at his right hand kept David from tottering. Now, this is something that we find in Psalms 16, verse 8. Psalm 16, verse 8. I keep Jehovah before me constantly, because he is at my right hand. I will never be shaken. Now, walking with Jehovah brings many benefits. We must make an appointment to walk with God, and that is something that we find in Amos chapter 3, verse 3. So that's Amos chapter 3, verse 3. Will two walk together unless they have agreed to meet? Those are interesting words, aren't they? Now, let's develop a close relationship with him. Now, wholesome human fellowship provided in Jehovah's clean organisation. Now, here we find others who are wholly and completely devoted to God and producing fruitage of his spirit. And that's the thing to look out for, isn't it, in people? Are they producing that fruitage of a spirit? Now, let's have a look at Psalm 122, verse 1. Psalm 122, verse 1. I rejoiced when they said to me, let us go to the house of Jehovah. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 17 and 18, that gives us some insight there as well. So that's 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 17 and 18. But I rejoice over the presence of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaeus, because they have made up for your not being here, for they have refreshed my spirit and yours. Therefore give recognition to men of that sort. So we see there how Paul was upbuilt by that association that he had there. So do we regularly attend all the meetings, assemblies and conventions with God's loyal ones? Well, our faithful brothers also need to be built up. Now let's have a look at 1 Thessalonians Chapter 5. So that's 1 Thessalonians Chapter 5, and we're looking at verse 11. Therefore, keep encouraging one another and building one another up, just as you are in fact doing. So we all need it, don't we? We all need to be built up and encouraged. Now, we need to lovingly help them to maintain an active association at meetings and in-field service. And like David's friendship with Jonathan, we can develop a similar friendship within a Christian congregation. Now, those whose expressions truly incite us to love and fine works are loyal friends, aren't they? So with everlasting life in view, choose your associates wisely. I'll leave you now with this question. How do your associates stand up? If you would like a free home Bible study at a time and place to suit you, please navigate your browser to jw.org and follow the links online. Thank you for listening.